I'm Bilal TanwEer, Pakistan, and I translate, I write fiction primarily, and I write some poetry off and on. I think there's a lot of attention, obviously the negative attention, but that helps fiction writers at least, because the world is interested in knowing these stories, and these stories have a sort of urgency to them, which I think definitely benefits you as a writer in terms of reaching out to an audience. Publishing is relatively easier. Um, so I think, yeah, and I think that this is an exciting time because there are lots of writers, at least in English, that are coming up, that are joining in this conversation. So I think that's probably it. The best thing would be is that everything needs to be done. Everything is a work in progress. Everything is in its infancy, so the opportunities are amazing because you can do whatever you want, especially in the arts. I think that is really incredible because whatever there was an original artistic cultural landscape, uh, which had been eroded gradually for the last 20-25 years, since we had this CIA backed dictator who sort of, under the guise of Islamization, he really ruined the cultural landscape. So that is being gradually rebuilt. And in the last 20 years, I mean, the difference between where we were 20 years ago to now is immense. So I think that I'm part of that generation which is sort of rebuilding that cultural landscape, which is very exciting. So I think that opportunities are incredible, and I think that uh, you, there is not that great a competition. So I think it's very exciting, and most of the people who are doing the most exciting work are kind of my age bracket. So I think the conversations are great, the energy is great, and everybody wants to do things. So that's very exciting. It does not happen very often, but once in a while, I'll say maybe once every, on average, every 3 stories I've written. Not written too many. Maybe I've written 15 stories, but once every 3 stories, there is a moment where you feel this sort of exhilaration. That could be fear, that you are probably opening yourself up in ways that makes you feel really afraid. It could be a sense, um, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost a spiritual feeling sometimes where you feel there are so many different pieces in your work, and all of them are suddenly coming together. uh, that's one part of the exhilaration. And then there could be simply that you are finding things about yourself that you never realized. So I remember I wrote one of the stories from the point of view of this really really sleazy character, and I thought that's, I mean, I felt that at some point in my, that I'd never, that's part of myself that I never actually had given voice to, which was really quite strange, and again, as I said, exhilarating. So about Iowa, I think it's a very strange place. Strange in the sense that it is a small university town, um, but the emphasis on writing, it's really strange, and the kind of priority writing receives, and the kind of limelight that writers over here get, that is very strange. And I also feel that this is not the most natural place for writers to come, and not the most natural habitat for writers, because writers usually are drawn to, you would expect them to get drawn to either really big cities, where they have a sort of a community, where there's a lot with a publishing industry, where there are other interesting things that are going on. There's a much sort of richer cultural milieu, or they would like want to isolate themselves between. You very rarely find writers between these two extremes. So I mean, right, and Iowa is somewhere very close to, much farther away from that big city feeling, but also not exactly that isolated place. So I just find it little strange, and but also special, because I think the kind of support that writing gets in this particular university, that is amazing, and I think that that is something that I feel very impressed by. I read lots of poetry. I read lots of poetry. I used to read most of my, again, poetry that I used to read was in Urdu. Uh, but I think that has again changed. Now I read lots of English poetry in English. Let me put it that way. Lots of translations. Zbigniew Herbert, the Polish writer, has become one of the most important writers for me personally. Um, and then there are a host of other writers that I adore. Jack Gilbert, the American poet, is somebody I think who's incredible and amazing. And Yeah, whole bunch of new writers. In Iowa City at Prairie Lights, I discovered Carl Dennis on the bargain books, and I think his poems are the wisest poems I've read in a while. So I think, yeah, no, I enjoy reading poetry very much, and I think I read poetry every day. And I can't say that for fiction. I don't think I read fiction every day, but I do read poetry every day. I think I am a believer, a very strong believer, that arts historically um, have been cultivated through patronage. If you take away that patronage, what would be left would be Hollywood, and this commercial, sort of commercially driven, uh, you know, culture, which is fine, which is great for entertainment, but it can go only so far in enriching the imagination, opening up the frontiers, setting the frontiers really, the limits of those frontiers of that particular community. So I think that artists are those sort of dreamers who keep pushing these frontiers, who keep challenging, what we consider to be our limitations on our imagination. So I think for those, to support them and to support that sort of activity, you do need patronage. Now, whether that patronage comes from the state or from other institutes. For instance, I mean, I keep giving this example. The Metropolitan Museum in New York City is has a budget of $160 million or thereabouts per year, and most of it is comes from either the state or comes from private donors, and that's why it's been made available to everybody. And if you give me the that, I don't see a counter argument to that. I don't see that there is an argument that Met should only be allowed to operate if people want to pay into it. No, that is a universal human heritage that everybody should be allowed to partake in. I think it's exactly the same. Artists are those who are trying to add to that body of universal heritage. They are people who are in conversation with that and trying to extend that. So I think that they need support for that. That is not something that they themselves benefit from. It's the larger community that benefits from it. So I think that larger community, whether in form of the state or through private institutes or donations, they ought to be supported, absolutely. It's very strange. Often when I'm writing stories, there are certain things that I'm writing about. I do think that it would be nice if somebody asked me about this and I could say, this. but those are usually very specific to the work. I'm not sure if there is anything general that I would expect my uh, readers or people in general to ask me. um, I'm not generally a fan of big general answers about my work anyway. I just like to be more specific. So yeah, I can't think of anything. It's been such a wonderful pleasure. I think I just want to thank the IWP and everybody else who's made this visit possible. I think it's been such a wonderful, enriching experience, and I think, just this gift of time, it's been so incredible. I think, I keep trying to think, how do I understand what's happening, because it's almost like hitting pause on your life, and then 3 months later you press play again and your life resumes, and in those 3 months you are free to do pretty much whatever you want. And I mean, the only way I can think about it is a gift. It's a gift that's been given to me, and I think it's a beautiful gift. So I just want to thank everybody who's made that possible, and I wish to thank everybody at IWP for making that possible. So thank you. An exciting time, because there are lots of writers, at least in English, that are coming up, that are joining in this conversation. So I think that's probably it. The best thing would be is that everything needs to be done. Everything is a work in progress. Everything is in its infancy, so obviously the negative attention, but that helps fiction writers, at least, because the world is interested in knowing these stories, and these stories have a sort of urgency to them, which I think definitely benefits you as a writer, in terms of reaching out to an audience. Publishing is relatively easier. um, so I think, yeah, and I think that this is Bilal Tanweer, Pakistan, and I translate, I write fiction primarily, and I write some poetry off and on. I think there's a lot of attention. Opportunities are amazing, because you can do whatever you want, especially in the arts. I think that is really incredible, because uh, whatever there was an original artistic cultural landscape, uh, which had been eroded gradually for the last 20-25 years, since